Good morning, everybody. Live from the Azrieli Mall in Jerusalem. We're just finishing the class that we didn't get to really finish yesterday. We're wrapping up Homer's Iliad. We're anticipating reading Homer's Odyssey. We looked yesterday at that triumphant scene for Achilles. Of course, for Achilles, triumph means utter conquest and decimation of his enemy, dragging Hector's body, spiking his heels, and dragging him around Troy, humiliating him. In many ways, as our guest pointed out yesterday, there's not a lot of difference between Achilles and corporate raiders or political predators. You name it, we got it. And Achilles is a kind of Homeric precedent for that. Interestingly, in the Iliad, we skip to the end, to book 24 in Andromache. Remember the long scene between her and Hector, when Hector, in that scene of ultimate cognitive dissonance, gives a blessing to his son, says he'll be a greater man than I am, when in fact we know Hector's going to die, he's going to die, and she's going to be led off. He's already imagined this. Hector already imagined she's going to be led off like a captive in a strange country. So let's just read this last passage, the end of the Iliad. So he called, the crowds fell back on their side, making way for the wagon carrying Hector's dead body unscathed. It's interesting in different traditions how bodies of people who are considered to have some kind of status in the Hebraic and rabbinic tradition. It's Sarah's body, I think, the rabbinic tradition does not change. And here, you can all correct me, here Hector's body, even after he's been savaged by Achilles, he's still in pristine shape. Once they brought him into the famous halls, they laid his body down on the large carved bed and set beside him singers to lead off the laments, the mourning dirges. The dirge is a lament for the dead, and their voices arose in grief. What does the Iliad end in? And Zeus was bringing the story of Troy to its end. The end is tragedy, catastrophe, and the women are left to grieve. That's really all that's left of the women. They lifted the dirge high as the woman wailed in answer. And white-armed Andromache led their songs of sorrow. White-armed because aristocratic women in the Greek world, they were white-armed. They didn't have to work. They were maintaining a certain kind of feminine delicacy that women of lower classes were not able to do. And white-armed Andromache led their songs of sorrow, cradling the head of Hector, man-killing Hector. I mean, really, even at the end, Homer's like throwing it in. You know, Hector is different from Achilles, but don't have illusions about him either. And notice again the juxtaposition. We use that term now a couple of times. Led their song of sorrows, cradling the head of Hector, that gentle feminine caress of man-killing Hector gently in her arms. You see how man-killing Hector in the Homeric verse itself is being cradled by her arms, cradling the head of Hector. That's one arm, man-killing Hector gently in her arms. He's surrounded by her. Oh, my husband, cut off from life, so we leave young. You leave me a widow, lost in the royal halls, and the boy only a baby. The son we bore together, you and I so doomed. I cannot think he will ever come to manhood, right? That's the penny has dropped for her. Long before that, the city will be sacked, plundered top to bottom, because you are dead, her great guardian. You who always defended Troy, the her is, I think, Troy, because you are dead, her great guardian, you who always defended Troy, who kept her loyal wives and helpless children safe. Loyal wives, it's in a way that it's the only loyal, I mean, Achilles not loyal. Loyal wives and helpless children safe. All who will soon be carried off in the hollow ships, the Greeks, and I with them. And you, my child, and here's her fantasy, will follow me to labor. Fantasy doesn't have to be a good thing, right? And you, my child, will follow me to labor somewhere at harsh, degrading work, slaving under some heartless master's eye. Hector, her husband, anticipated this in book 6, remember? That or some Achaean marauder, some Greek marauder, killer, will seize you by the arm and hurl you headlong down from the ramparts. Horrible. I think that's actually what happens. Enraged at you because, well, Hector, Hulot Sadiq, enraged at you because Hector once cut down his brother, his father, or his son. He had hundreds of armed Achaeans. Remember in the scene we looked at in book 19 when Briseis remembers, tries to take comfort in the memory of Patroclus, but also recalling her own family's murder by Achilles, and they're kind of mirror images, which kind of maybe gives us insight into book 22 as well, when the two warriors come together, and they really are kind of mirror images. Let's go back a minute. Enraged at you because Hector once cut down his brother, his father, or his son. Yes, hundreds of armed Achaeans gnawed the dust of the world, crushed by Hector's hands. Interesting here, Hector has just himself been dragged in the dust, gnawing the dust of his mouth, right open, gnawing the dust of the world, crushed by Hector's hands. They're not so different. Your father, remember, was no man of mercy, not in the horror of battle. Battle turns people into, even Hector, even noble Hector. Your father, remember, was no man of mercy, not in the horror of battle, and that is why the whole city of Troy mourns you now, my Hector. You've brought your parents accursed tears and grief, but to me most of all, you've left the horror, the heartbreak. Just a minute, a technical thing about translation. Some of you may have read the book called The Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, and maybe a few more of you. And if you can't read Conrad's work yet, you can certainly watch the movie, I think of the late 70s by Francis Ford Coppola, who is the director of, among other things, The Godfather, but he also directed Apocalypse Now, which is kind of a story. It's really a couple of he produces American stories, and this is the story of the Vietnam War, and they're and it's based on the Conrad book. And Martin Sheen, who's in the very young Martin Sheen, is in the jungles of Vietnam, and he comes across this giant old ancient palace. And inside the palace is a former, this is, I think his mission is to find this former colonel who had just gone crazy and turned himself into this kind of this chieftain of this Vietnamese tribe. Amazing scene in the film. And the guy is played by, wait for it, Marlon Brando, I think his last role. And in the book, the Conrad book, and also in the movie, when Marlon Brando is contemplating what he's experienced, this comes from the Conrad. He says the horror. This is the second time we've seen the horror in the Iliad. Our translator was certainly aware of the Conrad book, not the movie it came after. But the horror here is just interesting about translation, right? You can take a word in English, which has connotations. Connotations is meanings. Talked about this. A word that has connotation from other literary works. So when you read this word, the horror, and this is the great thing about reading a lot, is the more you read, the more you see, right? So let's go back. The whole city of Troy mourns you now, my Hector. You've brought your parents accursed tears of grief, but to me, most of all, you've left the horror, the heartbreak. Now here's these last lines of Andromache, very, very telling, and for us, an incredible way of transitioning into the Odyssey, because when we move from the Iliad to the Odyssey, we move into a very, very, very different world. Here's her lament, and we'll think back also to Briseis and Patroclus. And Briseis says, I never got to marry. Here she says, Andromache, for you never died in bed and stretched your arms to me, or said some last word from the heart I can remember, always weeping for you, all through all my nights and days. What is Andromache's fantasy? I mean, the pathos, emotion, the pathos, the patheticness of this is so strong. She is fantasizing about the possibility, not of Hector alive, but Hector having a different kind of death. For you never died in bed and stretched your arm to me or said some last words from the heart I can remember. No words from you, and also no heart, no hands reaching out. And really, at the end of the Iliad, we're just left with weeping, the mourning, the crying. Remember the invocation, the very beginning, the Iliad, and Zeus's will was moving towards its end. Here we are at its end, and the end, the last image that Homer gives us again is of the feminine. And the feminine here, her arms are reaching out. She's reaching out for her husband. She even wants to reach out to him in death, but he is not there. There is no masculine figure in the poem because they all destroy each other and protect the young, who can accompany the feminine. They're all gone, and they've all just created this catastrophic situation, which, and this is a crazy irony, really. The first great work in European literature, which is what we're studying, is about a tragic end. The beginning of European literature really begins with its ending in a kind of mourning. We also, let's just pull back a little bit, and we started reading, and we like Homer, oh, it's horrible, women are chattel. Yeah, women are chattel in Homer, and this is what our guest El said yesterday. Homer gives us a place. He lets us read. He lets us judge. He lets us evaluate. He turns us into. This is what the great thing about Homer, and Homer is the first work, no matter what kinds of antecedents, meaning predecessors, he might have had. Homer is the first person who forces us to read. Those of us, those people, and there are many, many people, right? We will not read this book. We will not read this book because Homer was a sexist, he was patriarchal, whatever. Homer lived in a patriarchal culture. It's like, in a way, you have to think of it. This is the lexical reality, lexical words. This is the linguistic reality that Homer lives in, right? He doesn't live in our reality. He doesn't live in the 2022 Israeli elections where certain kinds of ways of talking about politics are possible. Homer is speaking in the languages that are available to him. The languages available to him are the languages of glory. Because he uses them does not, can I repeat myself, does not mean he actually advocates them. And in fact, our reading of the Iliad, and I think we push this reading and we pushed it because Homer pulls us into it, where the only human words we see in the whole book, we didn't read the whole thing, but we saw Athena and we saw maybe Artemis, I don't remember, or maybe Hera, speaking of Hera's love and care for people. And we don't really see that in any other place. So the human seems to have been utterly destroyed in the Iliad. And Homer writes a second epic. We said when we read book 19 that there are two cities. The city in one of the cities, we talked about how they're really ideal cities. We could also look at what the city of war is, very much Troy, or the city of war is very much the Iliad. The city of peace, where there is the possibility of relationship, and relationship for Homer seems to mean some kind of relationship between the masculine and the feminine. That city of peace, I think for us usefully, at least as a start, we can locate in the Odyssey. And just as we are preparing to enter that poem about journeying, a poem about starting in one place and going a very, very far, long way away, and then coming back. The Odyssey is the paradigmatic, that's a very good word and a hard word for, what time is it now? 7:45. Paradigmatic, you might have heard of the word paradigm, the model. Homer's Odyssey is kind of the paradigmatic story of the journey, the individual journey, the challenges, starting in one place. We'll talk about this a lot, starting in one place, going to other places, and then coming back to the same place, but being utterly and totally different. The Odyssey is, in a way, all of our stories, a story of journeying, a story of finding identity. That's almost already, I asked you when thinking about the Odyssey, why does Odysseus not show up until book 5? Because up until book 5, Odysseus has no identity. He's been completely erased. He's erased when he's erased. We see Odysseus's presence. Good way of thinking of books 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. We see Odysseus's presence through his absence. So when we read book 1, and that's what we'll do tomorrow, when we read book 1, coffee, anybody? When we read book 1, we'll focus on just that. What are the consequences of Odysseus's absence? Who are some of the main characters? And please have this ready for tomorrow. We did this whole, I think the cast of characters for the Iliad, the Odyssey, is a little bit less complicated, right? We know a lot of the characters. We know Odysseus. He's married to Penelope. Their young son is I'll figure, why don't you Google, how old is Telemachus? Their young son, if he's not, I think he's at least 20, right? Their young son is much younger than his years. We find him at the beginning of the book. With the Iliad, we end with Andromache. With the Odyssey, we begin with Telemachus. We do not meet Odysseus again until book 5. Also, who are the other characters there? The suitors. How many suitors are there? And what are they doing on Ithaca, Odysseus's island? And what do they want? And how is Penelope trying to put them off? Oh yeah, who is our Odysseus? Now, people, I've been very patient with you about your reticence of assigning actors to our characters, but for the Odyssey, we really need to imagine Odysseus. He is a character, especially in the Odyssey, of much, much more complexity than anything we've ever seen before. And really, and Penelope, we don't see a lot of her, and let's reserve judgment about her. I mean, she is described by Homer as quiet Penelope. She is reserved in the home. She's instructed by different people at different times to stop bothering or getting involved in the realms of men and go back to her sewing, go back to her weaving, go back to her crying, or whatever she's doing. It seems that the realm of the feminine is not very different than what we saw in the Iliad, but we'll see it by the end of the Odyssey. It's Penelope becomes a character who's really equal to Odysseus. Anyway, any questions also about what we did yesterday, which was really interesting in that our guest Yael, she kind of took us into the text, and from into the text, she took us kind of out back. And what was really interesting, I think, about the approach was we went into the text and went out and were able to talk a little bit about our own world, but without, and this is very, very important, without in any way violating or we didn't use the text for our own purposes. People who use text for their own purposes are not readers. We became really good readers of the Iliad. And through that, we kind of became readers of ourselves for a moment. So if anybody wants to follow up on that, let's talk about that tomorrow. Anyway, look forward to seeing you. And we are now officially done with the Iliad. Well done, people.